name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester, and I know that some of you are familiar names and familiar faces to me. But if you don't know, I'll give you my intro spiel about who I am and what I do. So, county foresters are basically the way that the state supports the owners of private land, privately owned forest land. And so, in Vermont, we're about 75% forested. About 80% of those lands are owned by individuals and families, private ownership. And so, as we're going to talk about, those private forest lands are producing massive benefits that we all share and that are really important to all of us, from living in a really beautiful state to breathing clean air and drinking clean water and having really good wildlife habitat and stuff like that. So I say that county foresters do, in service of that, we do basically four things. So the first thing we do is we manage this tax abatement program called the Current Use Program. Its official name is the Use Value Appraisal Program, but it's often called Current Use or Land Use, UVA. That's where we spend a lot of our time. It's where people have to basically, if you have more than 25 acres of forested land, you can get a big tax break, essentially, for agreeing to manage your forested land according to a forest management plan. And I approve those forest management plans, I inspect those properties for compliance, and I help people understand how to manage their forest well. The second part is that if you are a forest landowner with a parcel of forested land of any size, I'll just come out and we can take a walk and talk about how to manage your land well, and how to do the right thing, what's going on. We are a resource for private landowners from a couple acres to thousands of acres in size. The third thing is that I help towns manage their town forests, municipal forests, and I really like to do like demonstration forest management on those lands and show people what really good forest management looks like. And then the fourth thing is just sort of addressing this question of how to make forest management in our counties better, and how to make forests in our county healthier. And so from county to county, that question will be really different. The answer to that question will be really different, but it's sort of the most exciting part of the job, because that's where we get to be creative about how we address what's going on. And so I'm really passionate about forest management and about thinking about how humans can actually be a positive influence and have a symbiotic relationship or a mutualistic relationship with our forests, how we can be sort of a keystone species that helps forests be healthy, not solely just because we want to take stuff from them and distract from them, but how we can actually manage them actively in a way that's good. And so that has led me all different kinds of places. And one of the places it has led me is to think about old growth forests. Old growth forests have fascinated me, one, because they're really rare and uncommon and special in Vermont, and also because they demonstrate to us how forests actually work. So it's this sort of question that I'll pose, if we're going to be involved in the management of forests, which we always will be, why wouldn't we want to manage them based on how they actually work, rather than on some idea of how we want them to work, sort of for our benefit? And beyond that, I think they're also like intrinsically really important and cool and worth saving. And so I want to, sort of on this journey of learning about old growth forests in the East, I've also learned that they are not what most people think of when they think about what old growth forests maybe are like or look like. So I really like doing this presentation to both highlight what old growth forests are like, some of the sort of surprising things about them, and possible ways that we can be in relationship with our forests in a way that's positive based on that. So here we go, old growth forests. I'm going to minimize this. Structure, complexity, and management. So the first thing to think about is, what is a forest? I always show this slide first. If you look up any definition of what a forest is, it'll basically always be a tree-focused definition. So it's a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth, or it's a dense growth of trees and shrubs. It's a large area full of trees, usually wild. So does that mean that any place that is covered in trees is a forest? And I think that what I've really realized is that forests are so much more than that. You know, we manage them as if they're just a bunch of trees in a given area, but what they are is these really dynamic systems. And so a more apt definition that we now use when we talk about forests is a definition like this for a natural community. And this is taken from Thompson and Sorensen's Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is a really great book on the natural communities of Vermont, where they talk about a natural community, and this could be applied to a forest, as many of our natural communities are, as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So it's more than even the individual organisms. It's an assemblage of organisms of different types, from plants to animals to invertebrates to fungi, all of these different things. Their physical environment and these processes, these dynamic changing attributes that affect them. So even the processes themselves have importance. And so it's important to remember that forests are systems. They're not just trees, and that they're engaged in this dynamic process. They're not static. They're incredibly dynamic. And so, you know, just as you'd find a million different definitions for what forests are, you would find even more probably for old growth. So what constitutes old growth is really complicated and sort of divisive, and we'll talk about why that is throughout this presentation. But here are sort of three big categories of how people define old growth. So they define them as primary forests. These are forests which have experienced virtually no disturbance from humans, also called virgin forests, or from European descended humans. So we know that native peoples had an impact on our landscape prior to European settlement, in some places more than others, probably in Vermont less as compared to parts of southern New England. But certainly they were involved. So in this way, you're sort of saying, okay, so either forests have to have had no disturbance from humans at all, or no disturbance from European descended humans specifically. But if it had disturbances, fires, stuff like that, that associated with native peoples, that's okay. And they might call it, the latter definition might be called original or pre-settlement forests. So interestingly, if you apply this definition, you can have old growth forests in which the forests are not actually old. So forests are, again, are dynamic. Death and disturbance is common in forests and is actually really, really important. And so it could be that a forest experienced a massive catastrophic disturbance, blew all the trees over. It still has had no disturbance from humans, but there's no old trees in it. A second definition could be what we might call old forest. So old growth forests as defined by having escaped extensive disturbance for a long period of time. So a compromise time period is 150 years. Some people would say more. For some forest types, it can be considerably less. Those are called primeval or ancient forests as well. And basically, this is the idea that regardless of how the forests have developed, they are old growth if basically they have not been, a large area of trees or forests have not been completely wiped out by disturbance, you know, over a pretty long period of time. And so this is very confusing because it doesn't also mean that all the trees will be over the 150 years old. It means that the forest itself will be over 150 years old. So you'll have some old trees, but also pockets of trees of all different sizes and ages. Old growth forests are also defined by their structure, so structurally complex forests. What we know about most eastern and actually western old growth forests as well is that they are forests with many different species, sizes, and ages of trees, lots of dead wood, and big old trees. So you could say that if you have forests that have those attributes, what we might call climax forests, then it's old growth. So all of these definitions have their own merits, and I will sort of weave in between them as we talk about what old growth forests are. One thing I will say is that I will probably not use this definition, this first definition, primary forests. The interesting thing about the idea of primary forests is that because virtually all of Vermont's landscape has been human altered in some way, primary forest essentially means it's a useful way to define existing old growth forest, but it also means that there could never be any old growth forest in any area that we've touched, which is I think a little bleak. So one of the interesting things about old growth forests, and if you think this or on subconscious level you think this, don't be ashamed because everybody does. most people think of the old growth forest as this sort of idealized park-like forest. So this area with these evenly spaced big trees, nothing growing in between them. You can see for a really long ways. It's this sort of idyllic vision of what a forest could look like. And unfortunately, for us and our sense of aesthetics, this is very, very far from the truth. Old growth forests actually usually look like this. And I'll talk about some of the different exceptions to these rules. But most eastern old growth forests will have some really big old trees like this yellow birch here, but they'll also have many different sizes and ages of trees. So we call this structural diversity. So a diversity of different canopy levels, structure, as a result of not being subject to big catastrophic disturbances all the time, but for the most part having individual small-scale disturbances that create new pockets of regeneration. So a big tree falls over, it takes another couple trees with it, and you get new regeneration sort of in that hole in the canopy. Another feature is canopy gaps. So in that previous picture, we saw a forest which would have a continuous canopy. So all the trees would be like the same height, and it would be, if you looked at it from the air, it would look like a pretty flat canopy. Well, what old growth forests actually look like, again, because of this constant small scale death and disturbance that's endemic to them, is they have this really, really diverse canopy. So they have big holes in the canopy gaps, which actually have a lot of ecological function, in addition to just creating pockets of light where light can hit the forest floor. And everywhere that happens, you're going to get regeneration of new species of trees. And again, the further diversity of that structure, more species and sizes and ages of trees. Another really important feature that old growth forests have that most of our younger forests don't have is lots of dead wood. So in old growth forest, obviously no one's going in there and taking the wood out, as every time the tree falls down, they're not taking those trees out of the woods. And so they're just allowed to rot. They're just allowed to lay on the forest floor and gradually become soil. And as those logs rot, they actually have a lot of really important functions, both as standing trees and then as trees on the forest floor. And we'll also talk about that a little bit later. There's usually a diversity of different species in old growth forests, but mostly some of our shade tolerant tree species, so like sugar maple and beech and hemlock. And the reason for this is because in old growth forests, while we have lots of small gaps that are created by these small scale disturbance events like we talked about, we don't have any of these big scale, large scale gaps, or we don't have as frequently these big, large scale gaps that suit some of our less shade tolerant tree species like white birch and aspen. And so over time, what you see is that species that can get by with less sunlight, our shade tolerance, end up being more common. And we also see deep, well-developed soils as a result of primarily the fact that trees are falling on the ground, become a new soil, and there's also some soil mixing that occurs as trees tip over. They sort of bring the lower levels of the soil up into the upper levels and create these really deep, structurally complex soils. So a compromise definition of old growth that might make everybody or nobody upset in sort of the old growth forest ecology community is it's a stage in forest development. So it's not a climax community that persists forever. It's a long-lasting stage that will happen to every forest as long as large-scale big disturbances like huge forest fires, huge windstorms, or clear cutting or something like that happens. They are forests which have developed without extensive disturbance. Again, small-scale disturbances, single trees, a few trees together, totally normal and part of the normal developmental process, but without big, extensive disturbance for a long period of time. Depending on the forest type, a good, what we usually say is 150 years, could be more, could be less. It just depends. The deadwood characteristics, having dead trees on the forest floor and dead standing trees that are like old growth forests, may not develop for 275 to 300 years. And we'll talk about how there's that may be linked to some other really important pieces of habitat and different layers of the old growth forest. Prior to European settlement, 55 to 60% of New England's forests were older than 150 years old. Today, it's about 0.4%. That's in New England. In Vermont, we think it's about 1,000 acres total in the state. And to give you a frame of reference, Chittenden County alone is 400,000 acres. So that number is interesting in a couple of different respects. One is that it means that not all of our landscape was in old growth forest, as you might think. 55 to 60% of it was, but the rest of it was in different younger developmental stages. So it wasn't just old growth forest, although old growth forest was probably the most common sort of forest stage on our landscape. So to talk about the way that forests develop over time and how they become old growth forests, this is sort of a graphic that's in like every forestry textbook that you'll ever see. This is the way that forests develop from nothing, from a field or from a clear cut, into an old growth forest. So they start with this stage called stand initiation. There's a lot of diversity in this stage, lots of different tree species, and also herbaceous species and shrubs growing. Over time, they'll move into this stage that's called stem exclusion. So this is when, and you've probably seen a lot of forests that are like this. This is when trees are growing up, they're competing with each other very aggressively. They're all about the same size, they're all about the same height. And because their crowns are so tightly knit together and they're competing with each other so aggressively, there is very little growth in the understory of the forest because there's just not any light getting through those tightly knit canopies. And so a lot of people think that sort of that earlier park-like picture that we looked at, or what people think of when they think of old growth forests, is they think of essentially the end of this stem exclusion phase. So that's when that initial generation of trees is all really big. There's still not much growing in the understory, but you have this sort of park-like mature appearance. This is what's called in the traditional forestry vernacular a mature forest. And in the traditional sort of forestry theory, a mature forest is one that is ready to be regenerated. So they would, cut those trees because they are considered to be economically mature and their growth is no longer as efficient as it was when they were younger trees. But then if you don't do that, if these trees don't blow over, if they're not all cut, you enter into some more interesting phases where the forest gets more complex. So these trees will succumb to little mortality events, maybe an insect outbreak, maybe a windstorm takes out one or two of them. Maybe they start to naturally decline because they're just getting old and their canopies recede a little bit, and some light starts to get through onto the forest floor. And so you see the establishment of some of these shade-tolerant species, new trees establishing in the understory of the forest, and those pockets of lights that are created. New shrub species and herbaceous species in the understory. And over time, what you'll see is that more and more gaps will be created, holes will be created in the canopy by natural mortality. Those little gaps that are created will be expanded over time, and you'll get all different sizes and shapes of different disturbances, which create opportunities for all different sizes and shapes of different trees. Different tree species need different amounts of light, they need different soil conditions. And so by having this really, really diverse, different series of things happening in the forest, you create opportunities for different things. And so you enter into this last phase, which is called gap dynamics, which also might be called climax, which also might be called old growth. And it doesn't look nearly as nice or as neat as what might happen when it's a quote unquote mature forest here at the end of the stem exclusion phase. But this is where we really get into some complex forests that are really, really diverse and really interesting. Here's a cool quote from this book, The Hidden Forest, The Biography of an Ecosystem by John R. Luoma. This is a great book. This is my favorite book about old growth forests. It's about western forests. He says, continuing scientific investigation has proven early forest scientists at least largely wrong to imagine that succession, so the process by which forest moves through these different phases, would ultimately lead to a permanent, self-maintaining, and stable climax community. Ecologists have come to believe that forest ecosystems, in fact, are as much about disturbance as they are about stability. So disturbance and stability is a really interesting thing to think about with old growth forests because they are sort of dynamic and changing all the time, but at the same time, by having more different species of trees growing in many different ways, they sort of buffer themselves from these large-scale disturbances. So in a way, they're actually more stable. This is a really cool graphic from another great resource by Tony D'Amato and Paul Cannizzaro about forest carbon that was published last year. So this is called a forest succession and development clock. And what it does is show you how 3 different attributes of the forest change as a forest develops in time. So as you go around here, these are the number of years that the forest is old. Again, this is not individual trees. This is the whole forest from age 0, which would be large-scale blowdown or a field or a clear cut, to age 500. Here on the outermost ring, you see changes in carbon storage over time. So starting out, you have basically no carbon in a young forest. Oftentimes, if there's a large-scale blowdown or a clear cut, most of the carbon that's been stored in the system is volatilized and released in the air back as carbon dioxide. Over time, you see this gradual aggradation, gradual increase of forest carbon in the system, and it just keeps on increasing. That's a process that's also called self-organization. So when a system, a complex system, is taking in more energy than it's releasing and using that to become more complex over time. So that carbon storage is increasing. This green circle shows how carbon sequestration changes over time. So storage is the total amount of carbon that's stored in a system in the forest. Sequestration is the amount of carbon that's being sucked out of the air, of carbon dioxide that's being sucked out of the air at any given time. So the way that trees make wood and that they grow is essentially by using the process of photosynthesis to fix carbon dioxide into carbon, which they use to make trees and bark and wood and all of those things. They are forests that are younger, from about 20 or 30 through about 60 or 70, are doing that really, really quickly. So they're doing that the most quickly. This was, for many years, the fact that young forests were sequestering more or sequestering carbon more quickly than old forests, as you see that this sort of declines as the forest gets older, was sort of a dog whistle to the timber industry, in that they said, well, we want to sequester more and more carbon out of the atmosphere, so we want to put in these big clear cuts to make young forests so we can sequester carbon more quickly. What they did not account for is the fact that though these young forests are sequestering carbon quickly, older forests are storing much more carbon. And when you do those clear cuts, you basically completely lose all the carbon that's been stored in that forest over time. So it's not totally a good way to actually go about mitigating climate change or mitigating the carbon dioxide we have in our atmosphere. So the innermost circle is showing how the different species of trees change over time. So in the beginning, we might have some of our shade intolerant species like white birch and aspen, pin cherry. We might move into shade mid-tolerant species, so that might be stuff like yellow birch and white ash. And then over time, we're going to mostly be in forests dominated by shade tolerant species like especially American beech, sugar maple, eastern hemlock. We know that prior to European settlement, from some of Charlie Cogville's work, that Chittenden County and most of Vermont was like 40 to 60% American beech. And that's just because they're really tolerant of shade and they can grow in this environment where there's not big openings, but there's regular small openings in the forest canopy. Now, last time I did this presentation, Liz Thompson, who's an inspiration and amazing ecologist who works for the Vermont Land Trust, pointed out a couple of examples where old growth forests do not behave typically. And she especially pointed me to this book, The Last Stand, which is a beautiful book. You guys should all get it, by Peter Kelly and Douglas Larson. The Last Stand is about these white cedar forests that grow on the Niagara Escarpment in Ontario. They are the oldest, most intact old growth forests in eastern North America, and they weren't discovered until I think 30 or 40 years ago. People didn't realize how old these white cedar trees were that are growing off of these cliffs. And the reason that they weren't disturbed is because they're growing on land on these vertical cliffs that nobody wanted, and they're not growing wood that anybody wanted to use for anything. And so you ended up with these white cedars that are in many cases 8 to 1,200 years old, and that have developed this really unique forest type. So they're vertical forests. They don't have any of the structural features that we talked about, although they do have actually a similar amount of distribution of trees of different ages if you look at the cliffs in general, but they don't have any of those normal features that we talked about, but they are absolutely amazing, really impressive forests. Another example that Liz pointed out was the Pisgah Forest in southwestern New Hampshire. I grew up right near this forest. It was, I grew up down in the Connecticut River Valley, and this was right across the river by Keene. So this is a place where there was documented old growth forest prior that was being managed by the Harvard Forestry School. And they documented that it was old growth in the 1920s. And then in 1938, all the trees blew over. And so it's a really interesting time and really interesting way of looking at a forest, because it hasn't been impacted by humans. It hasn't been cut. It hasn't been, had any of those impacts that humans so commonly do to our forests. Hasn't been fragmented and anything like that. But the forests are pretty young. They're at most 80 years old. And so this is an example of how old growth forests might not be old. So one of the really interesting things about old growth forests is how diverse they are. Now, biodiversity, I often just say diversity sort of as a shorthand, is comprised, actually, it's three different, but mostly of two different sort of types of diversity. There's alpha diversity, and that's just the species diversity that you probably are accustomed to thinking about. That's just the number of different species on a given site. And there's beta diversity. The beta diversity is the difference between one site, or the uniqueness of a site, as compared to all other sites across the landscape. And so there may be a place with very high alpha diversity, so a lot of different species of trees or plants, but that is not that uncommon across the landscape, whereas there might be a site with fewer trees or plants, less alpha diversity, but that the trees and plants that it has are unique. And so that would be said to have very high beta diversity. So old growth forests have both. So because old growth forests are so diverse, because they have trees of all different sizes, shapes, species, they support tons of different species with different habitat requirements. So as you can imagine, if they're creating all these different types of habitat, the different wildlife, plant, etc. species that use those types of habitat, all of them can have a home in these old growth forests, right? They're also have a high beta diversity because all of Vermont's forests are relatively young, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. Because all of Vermont's forests are relatively young, the features and the attributes of old growth forests are unique. And so they are something that's really special and different on our landscape, and so providing different opportunities for all these different species. Some of the coolest, if you look at research on old growth forests, some of the coolest diversity is the stuff you find on the really, really small scale. From invertebrates, bugs, arthropods, which are the base of the forest food web and have all these really important roles in forests as prey, and then also as nutrient cyclers and species who do a lot of other different things. Fungi, so many of us have probably heard about these underground mycorrhizal networks that connect different trees, enable them to pass messages and share nutrients between them. I think that used to be sort of a woo-woo-y idea, but it's just fact, and science continually backs up the connections and how forests really function as communities and are altruistic in many ways. And they also are really important nutrient cyclers. They help soils build. In a pinch of soil in the forest, you could have miles of fungal thread, hyphae, and they enable forests to reach up to 1,000 times more soil than they would be able to just with their own root system. So they're really, really, really important. Lichens and bryophytes, so liverworts, mosses. Lichens and mosses are habitat for invertebrates. They're sources of nitrogen, especially in western old growth forests. We've learned that liverworts are this really important thing that sucks up aerial nitrogen, and then when it falls on the floor, it deposits that nitrogen into the soil, and which is a limiting nutrient in these systems and allows trees to grow. And actually, certain types of liverworts won't grow unless they're in old growth forests, in western old growth forests. And they also influence microscale hydrology, the way that water runs off trees, and the leachate that influences the quality of that water. Salamanders are also really interesting. They are the apex predator of the forest floor, it's said. They have this profound influence on, especially invertebrate communities, by hunting them. And they're also themselves prey and, a lower rung on that food web and eaten by birds and stuff like that. Interestingly, salamanders are considered to have the largest biomass, so just the total weight of any vertebrate predator in the forest. So in Vermont's forests, if you took all of the coyotes and all the raccoons and all the bears and all the salamanders, and you weighed them all individually, the salamanders of Vermont would weigh the most, which is really fascinating. All of these things, invertebrates, fungi, lichens, and bryophytes, salamanders, are indicators of old growth and are specifically connected to the amount of dead wood that a forest has and the presence of big old trees. So those two things specifically help invertebrates, fungi, lichens, bryophytes, and salamanders exist. Another thing that's really important to say, again, talking about how, reframing the way we think about tree death and disturbances from something that's really scary and gross to something that's profound and life-giving and really exciting, is that research from old-growth forests suggests that dead trees often have 4 times as much living tissue as live trees. And the living tissue in those dead trees is not the tree itself. It is these invertebrates, these fungi, these lichens and bryophytes, these salamanders. Very, very, very interesting stuff. So talking about invertebrates, I just am fascinated by them. They're something that confounds us because they're hard to research and they're hard to see, and they're not as exciting as like seeing a moose, but they are absolutely critical to the way that our ecosystems work. So here's a graph in Vermont, of the number of different native mammals and the birds and the fish and the amphibians and reptiles with invertebrates taken out, right? So here is it with invertebrates in. So invertebrates, bugs, 21,000 species more or less in Vermont compared to 58 species of mammal. And so worldwide, there are about, that we know of, there are 1.25 million species of invertebrates and 60,000 species of everything else. So that's pretty amazing. E.O. Wilson, who's an amazing and inspirational biologist and studies especially invertebrates, he calls them the little things that make the world work, because they are digesting all of our plant material. They are pollinating our plants. Like 75% of Vermont's native plants need to be pollinated by insects. And they are really, really contributing to nutrient cycling. So breaking down wood and plant material that's allowing future generations of trees and plants to grow. All right, so this is what old growth forests are like. This is some stuff about them. What's the big deal, right? Well, so the reason that, again, in New England, there was 55 to 60% old growth prior to European settlement, and now we have less than 0.5%, can largely be traced back to land use history. So this is a picture of Heinsberg from the 1800s. In the early 1800s, many of you have probably heard the story. For resource exploitation, for charcoal for the railroads, and for iron smelting, and a bunch of other stuff. But especially for pasture for merino sheep, Vermont was, depending on who you ask, about 60 to 80% clear cut. And virtually everything over the course of the 1800s, virtually every forest was leveled at some point for some reason. And so what that means is that basically, probably, unless you're on the top of Camel's Hump, or in some really remote, inaccessible place, every forest you've ever been in was a field, or at the very least a stump field during this time. So that's pretty incredible. It had all these profound effects on wildlife. We extirpated catamounts and wolves and deer and moose and bear and otter and beaver and fisher, marten, Canada geese. We drove some species to extinction. So prior to European settlement, our native ungulates were caribou and a now extinct species of elk called the eastern elk. Passenger pigeons were also something that came through Vermont, no longer. And so we had these, just coming out of the 1800s, these massively altered landscapes. The timber industry in Vermont, there was sort of this in the 1700s, this initial boom of timber exploitation, and then really a second boom. So what happened is in the 1800s, the wool markets crashed, and a lot of those more marginal fields were allowed to revert to forests. And we actually, for a very brief period of time around 1900, Vermont was the timber capital of the world, with a lot of timber being shipped out of Burlington. With the trees that grew into those old fields, primarily white pine. But basically, this was, people thought when they got to Vermont that, and when they got to the New World in general, they thought that there was so much wood, especially coming from wood-starved Europe, there was so much wood that they were going to start cutting it. And by the time they got to the other side, the stuff that they had started cutting in the first place would have grown back and they could cut it all over again. Of course, that wasn't the case. And so what we're left with, following both this really intensive land use, pasturing, the clear cutting of these old growth forests, and then multiple sort of generations of forest exploitation, is forests that are regrowing in response to that. We're now 75% forested. We got up to about 80%, and now we're losing forest at the rate of a couple thousand acres a year, mostly to development. But our forests now are younger, they're less diverse, they lack big trees, dead wood, soil carbon. Our landscapes are also less diverse than those old growth landscapes. So remember, about 40% of our landscapes prior to European settlement were in younger forests. And actually those younger forests can be diverse in other ways. They can have many other different species of trees, and they can be really important habitat for some of Vermont's wildlife. And so now, because all of our forests across our whole landscape are about the same age, our landscapes haven't had a chance to sort of revert to a native balance of different forest types of different ages. The species we have are different because the forests haven't had a chance to undergo those natural transitions from, like, say, intolerant or species that are not very tolerant of shade to species which are more tolerant of shade, like we saw in that forest succession clock. Obviously, we have altered wildlife populations. So for instance, we've lost our apex predators. Coyotes moved into the state, but they weren't coyotes in Vermont until the 1940s. And our most prominent native ungulate is now white-tailed deer, which we don't think was very common in the state at all prior to European settlement, actually, which had to be reintroduced in the late 1800s. And the result is other different effects on our forests, like we're really concerned about deer overpopulations and the effect of those on our forest, because they don't have those native apex predators anymore, and they're increasingly we're doing a lot of other things to make them harder to hunt, like posting a lot of land and losing a lot of hunters and fragmenting our landscape. And in general, I would argue we have less healthy, resilient, productive forests. So coming out of the early 1900s, there's this idea that we had to manage our forests better, especially since seeing some of these landscape level effects, soil loss and erosion and all this other stuff of our land management practices. And so there's this idea, scientific or traditional, what's now called traditional forestry, that was primarily developed out of Europe, where they just needed to grow wood as efficiently as possible. And these, the initial way that this was applied was in these conifer plantations, which we still have, plantations of Norway spruce and white pine and Scots pine and red pine. And the idea is just that you're going to control basically every aspect of the way that trees grow and hope to grow timber more efficiently. And what we've learned is that you can grow wood efficiently this way sometimes, but it's no way to grow forests. And so this has moved on. We don't plant that many conifer plantations in Vermont anymore, but we still sometimes operate under this mindset of growing these regular rotations of valuable commercial trees without respect to the way that forests actually grow and develop. There's this idea of the regulated forest. That's where you control every aspect of the way forest grows. Efficiency, uniformity, regularity, which, as we're learning, we know that old growth forests are all about complexity and diversity and irregularity. A lot of times, and this is true even in modern forest management in many cases, you're removing all the trees as soon as they reach some targeted age of economic maturity. So economic maturity is when essentially the tree grows big enough that it's maxed out its largest potential value. And so you cut that tree that has nothing to do with the biological maturity of the tree, and it removes all those benefits that big trees give us ecologically in forests. And again, it's just not, I just can't see why you'd ever want to grow forests in a way that's not based on how forests naturally grow. But this is still the way that the vast majority of all timber that you buy and consume is grown. So especially loblolly pine plantations in the American Southeast, where trees are grown to saw timber on 25-year rotations, or in the Northwest with Douglas fir, or in the Northeast with black spruce. So the type of forestry that I do is what's called ecological forestry, and specifically I do ecological forestry that manages actively for old growth attributes. So the idea is that we're engaging actively with the forest, but we're managing them like they manage themselves. We're managing them as complex systems and thinking about them in a more holistic sense beyond just the trees. We're managing them specifically to be like old growth forests. And we're harvesting trees while trying to operate within the context of these natural developmental processes, not to replace these processes with processes that we think are better, which ultimately will always disenfranchise different species of wildlife or invertebrates or something else, some other element of forest ecology. So in practice, what this means is that we're taking our relatively young, relatively monocultured forests as a result of human land use, and we're actively encouraging them to develop many different sizes, ages, and species. So basically creating these small-scale disturbances on purpose. We're creating canopy gaps, so making their canopy more diverse. We're retaining and creating lots of dead wood, so I leave a ton of dead wood on the forest floor, and sometimes that's the part of it that I'm almost the most excited about. We're also retaining and recruiting, so keeping, not cutting, big old legacy trees. So this is one of the hardest things for loggers to understand sometimes, is why, that big tree, it's never going to get any better, it's never going to be any more valuable, why we're not cutting it. And what I usually answer is that we're not growing that tree for timber. So that's a structural legacy tree that we're keeping to confer to the forest the ecological benefits of big trees. So it can provide nesting habitat for barred owls, which need these big cavities in big trees. It can die and fall on the forest floor and provide the many benefits of large diameter deadwood on the forest floor to salamanders and everything else. So that's really, really important. And I don't think it's that hard to do. Usually you just sort of have to be willing to make a little sacrifice of not going out and cutting every big tree. We still create small pockets of early successional habitat, young forest, and other unique conditions which are underrepresented across the landscape. Remember, we talked about the landscape hasn't yet had time to develop the different mix of different forests of different types and ages. And we go out of our way to protect really sensitive and unusual features. So the other thing, and this isn't strictly about forest ecology, but this is another thing that I've certainly incorporated into my management, is thinking about social benefits, or not just saying we want to do the right thing ecologically and forget all the rest. So what I mean when I say forest management can benefit forests is that I mean that there are feedbacks in the work that we do that will ultimately benefit, number one, our quality of life as people, and then also back into the forests themselves. So wood is a local renewable resource, right? We love those. And by using local renewable resources instead of non-local, non-renewable resources, we know that this has climate benefits. Instead of, trucking wood from Oregon, we can be using wood that we created here. Also, I've been thinking more and more about environmental justice. So the way in which the impact of our environmental inability to regulate environmental quality and protect our ecosystems disproportionately affects different groups of people. As you can imagine, it affects the impoverished and communities of color much more than it affects wealthier, whiter communities. And one of the ways that we sort of get away without having to deal with the impacts of our resource consumption is by having this not in my backyard mentality, right? We have the privilege where we can be like, we don't want that here. And then we do not remove that impact. We just displace it onto people who don't have the privilege to say, not in my backyard. And so by having forest management here, we can sort of own the impact of our own resource consumption rather than just displacing it to some other community where you don't have to worry about it. And in many cases, again, those are going to be communities across our country or across the world that don't have the privilege to advocate for themselves in the same way and are disproportionately affected by the production and the processing of resources for us. Local resource production also means we have more control over their environmental and social impacts. Again, we're consuming wood and maybe we're rejecting, saying, you know, we don't want you to log next door to me, but I will consume the wood that was created by much more intensive, extractive, scary practices, you know, where they're spraying huge clouds of herbicide out of planes, you know, and everything else in the American Southeast, for instance. So having them locally, we have more control over what are the impacts of this work is. It also, because so much of our land is privately owned, having some periodic income generation that landowners can do makes it more affordable to own land. You got to pay thousands of dollars in taxes every year. And it also makes it so you don't have to be rich to own land. So which of course we don't want. So promoting economic equity. And we think it lowers development pressure as well. So having another way that people can make money off of their land sometimes actually protects forested land. So, and I got 10 more minutes. Okay. So all I'll say about that is that I think that we need to form a lot more nuanced of a view of how we look at forest management, especially the forest management that I do. It's not the same as creating old growth forests, but we know that it makes forests what we call old growthier. So it makes them more like old growth forests and provides a lot of those same structural benefits to wildlife that are utilizing them. And it does so sooner than those forests will create those benefits on their own. And so that's really, really important. And so if there's a way in which we can manage our forests that's really good for them and that's exciting and that is making them more healthy and more diverse and more complex, this wood is great. And this is something that we can be really excited about. So I went to a presentation that UVM professor, and again, amazing teacher and researcher Tony D'Amato, he says he doesn't talk about global change or climate change anymore. He talks about global change. Global change is climate change plus all the other stuff that we're doing to our forests. And so that includes the fact that we have altered natural disturbance regimes. We have introduced invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens. We are in the midst of a mass extinction of species and a loss of global biodiversity. For instance, we've lost 50% of the animals on the planet since the 1970s. Not 50% of the species, but 50% of the individual animals that were living on this planet are living here now, that were living here 50 years ago. We're losing forest, we're converting it to other uses, we're fragmenting it into smaller and smaller pieces, there are impacts of pollution and more. We live, whether you like it or not, we live in a highly altered and degraded landscape. And as a result of human behavior, and specifically European human behavior. And so, number one, we have to realize that old growth forests are a useful reference to the way that we understand how we're going to manage forests in the future. But we also have to manage forests which are adaptive, resilient, and that are going to be able to cope with the drastic environmental changes that are coming down the pike. And so taking cues from how forests used to grow and how old growth forests look, but then also understanding that the forests of tomorrow, the forests that we're growing, you know, that the little seedlings of today, when they're big trees, the forest that they grow into will be vastly different than the forests of today or than a couple hundred years ago. So the other thing that recognizing in the context of climate change and also all these other elements of global change, we need to also recognize that we may be beyond the point in some cases of just leaving ecosystems alone and hoping they heal themselves. So again, there's this idea that because we've caused all these problems that now we just need to be like hands off. There's no possible way that we could positively benefit our forests. But I really, really believe that there is a place for humans that could actually be positive. And that would not mean that we just have to say, you know, forget about it, and that we could actually facilitate ecosystems being healthy actively. So one of the ways that we're thinking about forestry now in the context of climate change and global change is that we've sacrificed this traditional idea of stability, sort of an unchanging static forest, for resilience. So what we really want is we want forests which are able to change, but able to maintain their health and natural processes throughout incredible amounts of stress and change that we know are coming. So how do we do that? There's another book or another resource, also by Tony D'Amato and Paul Cannizaro, and also by Emily Huff. It's called Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future. And they say the goals of forest resiliency are these four. So number one, keep forests forested and connected. So forests can't provide any of these benefits or be resilient or do anything else if they are turned into a parking lot or even a field or split up into tiny little pieces. To reduce stressors, so limit the amount of stress that forests face in order to reduce figures. So this could mean actively trying to reduce some of the human-created stressors that we've created. Reducing vulnerability, so making the forest more resilient by establishing actively forests with a complex structure. So that's, like we talk about in ecological forest management, actively creating those small-scale disturbances to make those forests structurally more like old-growth forests. And provide refuge, maintain the maximum level of plant and animal diversity over time. I'm going to show you all these resources after, so don't worry, and I'll send them out to you if you're interested. There's also a really cool thing called Vermont Conservation Design that was put out by the Agency of Natural Resources, and specifically Fish and Wildlife and the Vermont Land Trust recently in 2018. And the idea is that they're trying to think about how we maintain a functional landscape. So they talk about both young, early successional, as we call it, forest and old forest. And so they say a return to the pre-European abundance of young forest, approximately 3 to 5%, is needed to reverse a declining trend and reach a level that at one time supported all of Vermont's native species that require young forest. So again, this is talking about we're not just making old forest everywhere, we're also making different forest types of different ages to create, again, a more functional landscape. That's probably more like our landscape hundreds of years ago. They also go on to say, while it's not practical or possible to return to a landscape dominated by old forest, allowing about 9% of Vermont's forest to become old forest will bring this missing component back to Vermont's landscape and offer confidence that species that benefit from or depend on this condition can persist. So 9% of Vermont's forest is about 6.7% of our landscape. I think that's a pretty modest goal. They go on to say, in most forests, passive restoration will result in old forest. In some cases, active forest management may provide forest composition and structure suitable for subsequent passive restoration. So you could have forests that you're leaving alone, passive restoration. You could have forests that you're managing to be more like old growth forests and then leaving alone. That's sort of the active and then passive. Or you could have forests that you're continually managing to be more like old growth forest, which is more of an active but an ecological approach. So what do we do? And I think I'm going to land right in time, which is a miracle because I've never done this presentation before, and I did not know if it was going to be the right amount of time. So what do we do? Obviously, I think all remaining old growth forests we should protect forever. So in Vermont, if we've got 0.5% old growth forest, there's no way that we should ever allow anything else to happen to that teeny little fragment of old growth forest. They're just too valuable to us, both ecologically and also sort of as reference so that we can understand how our forests work. We should also set aside more land as old growth reserves for landscape scale diversity and reference. I think that 9% of Vermont's forest is pretty modest, but certainly something to look at. It's weird because I also really like active forest management, and I do it all the time, and I think it's really exciting. That in some ways, I think it's very threatening to sort of our forestry establishment to think about having land that's set aside never to be managed. I don't think that that's threatening at all, and I think that having blocks of old growth forest, we know, will enrich the quality of the other forests that we have that are not old growth forests. I think that they will benefit us immeasurably. protect all forests from fragmentation and loss. So a forest cannot be a forest, cannot give to us the benefits of a forest, cannot become an old growth forest if they're fragmented into little pieces or converted into a housing site. It's also important that we consider social impacts and also consider things on a global scale associated with our management choices. So we're not just improving stuff here at the expense of others or worsening global situations. So an example of this is not protecting our forests, not protecting our old growth forests, but pointing our finger at someone across the globe and saying, but you have to, so that we can have, you know, our climate change situation mitigated, but we don't have to do anything. So I think that that's really important, and also understanding stuff like, again, like the broader implications of not having local renewable resources like forest products, and the global implications of that is often more environmental degradation. It's just somewhere else in the world, and so impacts on other peoples in the world that we don't have to deal with. We also need to actively control the things that we've created, the problems we've created. So invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, other human-created problems like deer overpopulation, pollution, forest fragmentation. You know, I think that the minimum, what I often say is that the minimum level of responsible management is not no management. It's no management plus invasive species management. So we introduced these really virulent invasive species that prevent natural forest processes from occurring. And so if we want a forest to become old growth, we have to deal with it. I think it's our responsibility. And also generally to manage forests actively for resilience, adaptation, old growth attributes, using these ecological forestry principles. So I think, again, there's an opening for us to engage with the forest in a way that's actually positive. I really believe that we can do that. So I just love old growth forests, and I love reading about them. And if you guys are interested in some really cool resources, here's a bunch of them. I'd also be happy to send the PDF of this presentation to anybody who's interested. Some of these ones I mentioned, this one, Ecology and Recovery of Old Growth, Eastern Old Growth Forest and Eastern Old Growth Forest. This one are both pretty researchy, but really interesting, as is this Old Growth Forest, a literature review of the characteristics of Eastern North American forests. These two are very accessible. The Hidden Forest is about Western Old Growth Forest, and it's just awesome. It's got a narrative to it. It's about the Andrews Experimental Forest in Washington or Oregon. And this last stand is about those cliff face cedars of the Niagara Escarpment. Increasing forest resiliency for uncertain future, forest carbon, Vermont conservation design, and restoring old growth characteristics are all pretty digestible. So lastly, just for some plugs, I will plug that I do demonstration forest management, especially on town forests. Especially on town forests, and I'm getting ready to do one right now at the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond. You can check it out. You can do a self-guided tour of the marking I've done through the end of this month. If you check out the Andrews Community Forest page of the Richmond Town website, or shoot me an email, I'll send you a link. I also have a YouTube channel where I record all these webinars, and there's an Andrews Community Forest playlist. So I'm doing, you know, because we can't do these big virtual or big public in-person events, I'm doing these different videos that I put up on my YouTube channel about what's going on. You can also check out recordings of other webinars I've done and short videos. You can sign up for my email list by just emailing me, ethan.tapper@vermont.gov, and I'll put you on there. And you can sign up for e-news or follow on social media all of these great organizations: Vermont Cover, it's Audubon Vermont, Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and others. We're all working together to try and get you guys different cool opportunities to be educated and learn about forests. So with that, I will hopefully stop sharing. There we go. And I would love to take some of your questions. I know that was a lot.
No, that's perfect timing. And yes, we do have time for questions. So what you can do is you can, again, hit that little raise your hand button if you want to ask your question live, or you can type your question into the chat and we can get those into Ethan. It looks like we do have a hand raised from Elisa. So Elisa, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, you're more than welcome.
Hi, it's Alyssa. I am wondering if the Andrews Community Forest is an old growth
No, it's not. It's not right now.
forest. Are.
What's that? What was that last part?
Can you tell us where some of the old growth forests are in Vermont?
Yeah, so so if you look up, there was a VPR story, I think last year, about old growth forests, maybe even earlier this year. They actually published a list of where all the known old growth forests are in Vermont, which would be a better list. So if you just look up old growth forests, Vermont, VPR, it should show up. I think it was part of their Brave Little State program, and that'd be a whole list. I know that the closest one to here that we think is an old growth forest is Williams Woods in Charlotte, which is on East Thompson's Point Road, and then also the Cambridge Pines up in Cambridge. And the Williams Woods one is really funny. I think it's a really good looking forest, but it's definitely complex, and it's definitely, messy looking. And one of the great story I didn't tell in this presentation, but that I often tell, is that I took a group out there and we walked through this, sort of younger forest, and they're like, oh, this looks really nice. And then we went into the old growth part, and one of them said, oh, I don't like that. And it just these old growth forests are so complex, it sort of flies in the face of all of our intuitive sense about what forests are supposed to look like. There's big trees, but there's also big trees on the ground and all kinds of young growth and all kinds of weird different structures that people aren't used to, or they don't think look intuitively nice. So I can find that list for you, or you can just look up VPR old growth and it'll give you a comprehensive list.
Yeah, it looks like we had somebody, Ashley saw it, linked that in the chat for everybody. So if you can pull up the chat window, that link is there for you. Thanks for that question. That was great. If anybody else has any questions, looks like I have a hand raised from Logan. If you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question, you're more than welcome.
Hi, can you hear me? Awesome. Ethan, when you're actively managing a property for some old growth, characteristics, what are some of the factors that you're looking for with how to manage it? So, for example, on my property, I've got what looks to be kind of a younger black cherry tree, and it's only like one of two that I've been able to identify, and it's kind of getting choked out by some hemlock, and there's a ton of hemlock on the property. So I was thinking about trying to release that cherry tree to really kind of help it grow over time. And so I'm trying to think about, okay, what do I do with these hemlocks? Do I kind of girdle them? Do I drop them in one direction opposed to another? Do I want to try to mimic like a small disturbance of maybe like what a tornado would do if it came through, or like some other type of windstorm? Like, so how do you make those decisions? What do you kind of look for to help kind of guide you? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean it's probably more complicated than I can express here. One thing that I found recently when I was a big part of what foresters do if we're working on like an active forest management logging is that we mark all the trees to be cut. And so what I realized I was doing when I'm sort of applying this ecological framework recently when I was marking is that I realized that I was sort of, my instincts were telling me to make everything uniform and simplistic. And what I was doing was actively trying to disrupt the uniformity of the forest and to make it more complex and less uniform and sort of what may seem on the surface to be more chaotic, but really just making it more irregular and again complex. So it's hard to give you a blanket answer, but one thing I would say is that trying to enhance diversity at every turn. So for instance, I've had this experience where I used to work in big timberlands in the Adirondacks when I was in college, and I'd be marking trees all day long, and I would see one tree. So let's say I see a black cherry tree, hadn't seen a black cherry tree all day long, and my instinct is, oh, you got to cut that tree. That doesn't belong here. got to like make everything uniform and simple again. And you want to do exactly the opposite of that. So if you only have one black cherry tree, you want to encourage that black cherry tree to grow in general. If you only have trees that are about one size, or if, you know, on a small parcel, you should also look to adjacent properties. If you've got the only hemlock on a whole big area, you know, you have something that's unique. And so you could sort of look at on your property scale, like what do I have on my property? And then also on a more macro scale, what's available on the landscape. I think that's the sort of the most concise answer that I can give you. And then the other thing you can do is, like, if you're in my county, you can call me and we'll just go take a walk and talk about it, about how to apply that on the landscape. You can sort of enlist the help of someone who, you know, thinks a lot about this stuff, or a consulting forester.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And the other thing I was going to say is that I didn't answer the first question of the previous person's or the first part of the previous person's question, which is that the Andrews Community Forest is not an old growth forest, but we're managing it with what's called like a triad model. So we're managing 3 different zones of the forest in 3 different ways, and about a third of the forest we're not managing at all, except for invasive species management. And one area that's sort of in the lighter touch area, we're managing specifically for old growth attributes, and managing it to be more like an old growth forest. And then the other area, which we're not managing at all over the next 10 years, the third zone would be potentially open to creating some more early successional habitat, if that seemed like it was a thing that made sense to do.
All right, so it looks like we have a question from Lynn as well. If Logan, you've had your question answered, you can go ahead and hit that raise your hand button, or if you have another question, that's fine. But Lynn, if you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute now.
She's still muted.
Lynn, you're still muted, it looks like. Do you want me to unmute you? Oh, there we go.
Okay. I think you might have just answered this, but if someone has some forested acreage, like the person who just spoke, can you get a consultation or a consult from the forest department or somewhere, or UVM or something to find out what to walk the land with you and find out what to do?
Yeah, call your county forester.
County? We have a county forester.
Yeah, are you in Vermont?
Yeah.
Which county are you in?
Chittenden.
You're in Chittenden, so I'm your county forester. So you call me, and we go for a walk. I do it all the time.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Is there anybody else who has questions or comments? Again, you can type into the chat box, or you can do that raise your hand feature.
I think I saw some stuff in the chat as well.
Yeah, there was some chatting in the chat. I don't know if there were as many questions, but let's go back.
Let me see if I can bring it up. And then maybe I can see something.
It looks like there's a question from Steve-O about fire control by Native Americans, if that's a factor we'd be talking about.
If fire control by Native Americans?
Yeah.
So I've been actually researching this because I really want to know. I think that there's, I don't necessarily think it's the most, I think sometimes the amount that Native Americans impacted the landscape prior to European settlement can be used as an impact for like a heavy hand with management, because people are like, well, these forests need human management, which is really not the case. We know that the impact of native peoples on the landscape, especially through burning, was much greater in southern New England, so especially like around the Cape. But it's really hard because we had research come out from Harvard about they took all these soil cores of these ponds and stuff like that, and they did not find charcoal in them, which led them to conclude that there had not been widespread Native American burning. But there's also some firsthand accounts of saying that it was very, very prominent. The problem is that a lot of those accounts are biased and racist and have other stuff that's attached to them. And so it's very hard to sometimes separate out what actually was happening versus like the perception based on all this other stuff. But yeah, we know that there were Native people here in Vermont, and that burning was probably something they did to some extent. We don't think that widespread widespread burning was something that happened a lot in Vermont, but we think it happened a lot in southern New England, coastal Maine, coastal New Hampshire, stuff like that, where there were more widespread sedentary year-long populations of people.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'll leave a few more minutes for any last-minute questions to come through, either with that raised hand or in the chat. Otherwise, thank you.
I saw a couple other things. I'm just scanning through here, Carrie.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Someone mentioned Suzanne Simard did an amazing TED Talk about tree communication. She's really an innovator who's discovered a lot of the different ways that trees communicate with each other and pass resources between each other. And her work is really, really important. And so the other thing that someone mentioned is that book that I did not like as much, called The Secret. So the one I was talking about is The Hidden Life of Forests, not The Secret Life of Trees. So The Secret Life of Trees is that one by the German forester. I don't know, I guess my understanding of how forest works is sort of related to the fact that they require disturbance, and that change and that the dynamic nature of forests is one of the things that's really important. And when I learned about the work of Susan Simard, and the fact that trees were really behaving as systems, they're altruistic and helping each other, a lot of people, when they hear that about forests, they say, well, trees are like people, right? So then we have to have this whole different way of interacting with them. So we should, treat them like people and, have to be really scared to ever cut a tree or something like that. For me, that research was vindicating, because for me, it said forests are superorganisms. They're comprised of all these different trees in a community, and that within that community, death is, something that is not a big deal, or is something that is a big deal, but in a positive way. That book, The Secret Life of Trees, to my eye, it sort of anthropomorphized trees to a certain extent, whereas what I would do is I might anthropomorphize forests and think about it in sort of a forest context, whereas he talks about them very much like they're people, and it didn't sit totally right with me in terms of my understanding of forest. But I know a lot of people also connected with that book. I really you guys should really check out that book by John R. Luoma. The book I was just referring to was The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter, Walhaven. I see that in Stephen yours. And I really like the book that I have right here, The Hidden Forest. That's what I'm trying to say. So not The Hidden Life of Trees, The Hidden Forest. This one's really, really special. Let me see if there's anything else that we could quickly address.
It looks like Annette in the chat wrote, what about planting as opposed to, quote, discovering species in a forest?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that, there's some opportunities to get creative about the way in which we interact with our forests in a way that could be positive. So in traditional forestry, or the way that it's being done right now in Vermont, we don't really plant trees ever. So what we do is we basically create small-scale disturbances. We, cut trees, essentially. And the conditions that we create natural regeneration. That natural regeneration is at times thwarted by human-created situations. So by deer browse, because we have too many deer, or by invasive exotic plants which crowd out our native species, or by other problems that we've created, or natural things. So I think there's an opportunity to do some planting, to, for instance, replace a species that was completely cut out of a forest. So on my forest in Bolton, I know that there was white oak in my forest. And I know that my forest was absolutely ravaged by very extractive liquidation logging, and that it was all cut. And so I replanted white oak. Another example of when it might be positive to plant trees is when we're talking about climate adaptation. And this is not something that I feel as confident in advising you on, but I know that there's some ideas about assisted migration and helping some of these tree species that are about to become more adapted to our climate as our climate changes to become established in an area that is north of their range. So people are thinking about that, planting some of these southern oaks or chestnuts, stuff like that, to sort of supplement natural regeneration, with the understanding that some of our native trees are going to become stressed out and less well suited to our environment as our climate changes. And some of these other species that used to not be suited to our climate will be. And Bana, I see in the chat, Bana said The Hidden Forest by John R. Luoma. That's correct, Bana. John Irwin also said, can you refer me to the latest practices in controlling invasive plants? This is another place that I get myself into a little bit of trouble. I get myself into trouble by telling people that I think it's okay to cut trees sometimes. I get in trouble sometimes because I tell people that we've got to kill more deer because we are the apex predator of the deer, because we've extirpated all of their native apex predators. Also, we got to kill invasive plants. So it may not be a big issue to you, but as someone who walks through the woods all the time and walks through literally tens of thousands of acres of forest a year, invasive exotic plants are like one of the biggest problems and threats that we face. The scientific community is united about it's an issue that is a huge threat to our native species and to our biodiversity. They displace our native species and they prevent natural forest practices. In so doing, they prevent natural forest processes from occurring, natural regeneration, stuff like that. And so the problem is that these species that we've introduced are in many cases like almost impossible to kill. And where they may be possible to kill, they may not be possible to kill through the methods that we want to use. So this is another weird thing, and we could talk more about this, but this is like a whole other can of worms, where we can use herbicide, a little bit of herbicide in a really targeted, minimal way to control invasive plants. And basically, that is, in many cases, is the difference between doing something about it or not doing something about it. If we don't have to use herbicide, we shouldn't. But for most invasive plant infestations of any scale, they are not killable by hand. You can't pull them. Cutting them is what I call just making them mad, and it doesn't work. And so we need to address invasive exotic plant infestations, and weirdly, it may require us to become comfortable with the use of this thing that we, in many cases, don't like, in a really different context from the way it's used and the way we don't like it, like in agriculture, to do something that's actually really positive for our forest. And so if you go on my YouTube channel, I did a webinar, an hour-long webinar on invasive plant control, and I also have a 6-minute video on using this really, really cool herbicide application tool called a buckthorn blaster, which applies herbicide to the surface of a cut stump in a way that's like a fraction of an ounce of herbicide applied directly to a target plant that never spills or gets anywhere. So that video is on there as well. And you can always go to vtinvasives.org. I'll type that in here. And find all kinds of interesting resources about identifying invasive plants and also dealing with them.
Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to, first of all, thank Ethan for his time and his knowledge today. This was so great. And thank everybody who joined us. I'm really appreciative of having everybody who's interested in these kind of topics to allow us to keep hosting these webinars with Ethan and with other people involved in the natural community. So I will be sending out a survey to everybody who participated today through that Eventbrite email. And I'll also be sending out the link to the video when we're able to put it up onto our social media channels. It takes a few days to download and do all that, but probably early next week we'll get it up there in case anybody missed any parts of it and wants to see the recording. So thank you all so much.